on its way, sort of from very humble beginnings, trying to improve, essentially what it was a couple of teams kind of working out of Microsoft Seattle and then connected with a team in India. I'll tell you a little bit about that story. It's now kind of looking at itself and saying, you know what, there is a new way we need to work in this century, right? We have tried all sorts of different things, and they really haven't actually landed us very far, right? If you look at how knowledge work is done, the service industry done, it doesn't look a lot different than it did 20, 30, 40 years ago. At least if you look at it from the perspective of business results, right? There's all sorts of efficiencies gained in teams, absolutely. But improving business performance, there was a stat out there that said something, I think Shuman, you had it the other day, 6%?
6%.
6% of organizations polled said that, introducing agility into their teams led to improved business results. The other 94% said, no, we haven't had any actual increase in our business results. So there's this challenge. How do we go about creating a 21st century management method that actually improves business results? And I would say that Kanban is trying to answer that question, and it's one of these things that have been evolving for some time, right? I talked about myself earlier, and I'll just give you kind of a brief sort of overview of what one way to think about Kanban. How we define agility from a Kanban perspective. If you leave here today, this one word is the one that I want you to kind of hold on to. And it's the word balance. It's trying to get you to think about what that right balance is, and it's going to be different from business to business to business. So, there's no kind of recipe book that says, you know what, this is a ratio of this to this you need to do in our organization. You're going to have to figure it out yourself, but here are some ways to do it. So, on the one hand, the first thing that you're trying to balance is demand. Your customers, they have wants, their needs. You have a market to serve, and guess what? It's changing. And in fact, there are all sorts of theories as to why, but the rate and pace of changing customer needs seems to be accelerating. Has anyone experienced kind of an increase over the last 10, 20 years of customer needs changing? Right? Some are laughing like, duh, right? And yet, on the capability side, if you want to be fit, you need to be congruent. Your capability needs to match that rate of change. The customer doesn't care that you're not ready for them, right? Or they're going to go and choose a business that is ready. So that's a competitive nature of business, right? So how do you get these things in balance? So what happens when your demand and capabilities are out of balance, right? Typically, overworked and unproductive workers, right? Does that feel like round one? Right? Has anyone been in an environment where people are overworked? Right? So we're not speaking kind of, sci-fi here, right? Quality issues, delays and dissatisfaction. Has anyone seen that? Lack of predictability. We said this, but something else happened. Has anyone experienced that? Has anyone missed a deadline? Right, so these are the things that happen when your demand and capability are not aligned, right? It's a mismatch, right? So you're trying to serve a market, and you're trying to say yes, and everything's first class, and we're not sure, and how many votes should be there, and what's the upper limit? Okay, we can't make a decision, let's make it infinity. There's a mismatch. And these are the things that generally happen as a result of that mismatch. So what could you do, right? You could refuse the work, good luck, right? You could refuse the work, but they're just going to go across the street to the organization, the company, that won't refuse the work, right? Could hire more people. Is that sustainable? Right? You could train people better. Guess what? This is the smartest we've ever been. This is the most highly educated generation ever. People know their stuff, right? Sure, you can get better, but it's seriously diminishing returns, right? So you can train and you can hope, but it's not going to necessarily solve your problem. So what are you going to do? Kanban suggests you have to work on both sides. On the demand side, you need to shape it. So you need to think about things like what we saw earlier, class of service. How am I going to treat red boats versus white boats, right? Do I have a strategy for that? Am I going to look at things like cost of delay? Okay, so this thing, if we delay it, no big deal. This other thing, if we delay it, we lose the account. We've committed to building the stadium for the Olympics. We can't delay that, right? Treating things differently, so shaping the demand. From a capability side, what's causing your delays? What are your bottlenecks? Is my process streamlined? Am I reviewing things, right? So by looking at both sides of the equation here, Kanban is trying to say, okay, so if we can attack both ends, we can get closer and closer to balance. Is it going to be perfect? No. But the closer you get, the more competitive you will be, and those that you're competing against that are having a much bigger balance will have a tougher time competing against your enterprise. And so this is kind of the overall goal of Kanban. So here's the thing. Kanban Method seeks to achieve balance between customer demands and business capabilities. Agility is part of that, but I would say that if you're looking at Kanban, the superset of that is about balance. Agility is one of the tools that allows you to get there, but it's just one of the subsets of Kanban. All right, so that's great. It sounds impressive. Did someone just kind of wake up one day and say, okay, so here's the Kanban method, and this is how we're going to do things? Not really, right? There are all sorts of ideas, a lot of things borrowed from Lean, systems thinking, a lot of different disciplines, and a lot more over the subsequent 15 years. But the story of the evolution of Kanban, when I ask people, what was your first kind of introduction to it, they usually talk about this book. Has anyone seen this book before? Right. So for a lot of people, Kanban started with this blue book. And, it's definitely a big point in its history, but there's actually a lot of stuff that happened before it, and there's a lot of stuff that's happened after it. Does incidentally anyone know when this book was published? 80s? Not quite that old. Remember, I said 15 years, right? So 9 years ago, right? So, and this is still a very popular book. It's still a bestseller. It sells thousands of copies. It's still very relevant today, but guess what? There's been 9 years of evolving practices and approaches since this was published, right? So, when a lot of people ask me about reading this book, I said, go for it. It's great. It's relevant. You'll probably have to do more afterwards. Does anyone know where Kanban comes from, the word? Japanese? Car manufacturers? Not quite. Japanese was right. Sorry? Toyota? No, it's not from Toyota.
Isn't it visual signal? Yes.
Yeah. So its original history actually dates to these old shops, restaurants. Has anyone traveled to Japan? A few people. You might see some of these still there, and it's a signal outside an establishment saying, you can come in and you can get service. We're not full, we're open. We have capacity for you, right? It's a signal that says, we can go in and we can support you. Whether you're buying stuff, getting a bite to eat, whatever. So in Kanban, as kind of the method has co-opted this from the Japanese and said, you know, we're going to use the same concept of signaling to say, you know, we're ready to take on work. What was the signal in round 2? Yeah. The moment you had your hand up, right, and there was nothing there, that's a signal. That's, I have a slot open, right? That's your Kanban, right? So that hand up, that's your Kanban, right? That's the signal that there is, in fact, availability. All right, so let's look at this 15 years of the evolution of Kanban. Started in 2004. I'll start with sort of talking about kind of I would say it's sort of in a few phases. First part was, you know, what we kind of call the pioneers. People were just figuring things out. Pretty much a lot of the experiences that led up to the actual creation of the Blue Book. People were fed up with old ways of working. They were trying new things out. They were leveraging approaches from other practices and bringing it into knowledge work, bringing it into software, bringing it to the service industry. Beyond that, there was what we kind of call a bit of an enthusiast phase where people sort of picked up the book, got connected to the community and started to try this out. Started to get some really good results, but definitely not a mainstream thing. In the subsequent years, there have been early adopters. You know, there's lots of sort of auxiliaries of Kanban. And then as we kind of get into 2019, there's some very striking statistics about the use of Kanban in industry, particularly in geographies outside of Canada, right? It has grown and grown, and if you go to the US, Brazil, Germany, UK, the rest of Europe, Kanban is being used as often as a lot of other options, right? So its growth has been quite phenomenal. So it's no longer this kind of, you know, kind of enthusiast thing. Let's try it out. Let's geek out. You know, put together a whiteboard. It's starting to become a de facto way of improving very large enterprises. All right, so let's go back to 2004. Microsoft XIT is really where things started, and a guy named Dragos was working in Microsoft, and he was supporting a offshore group, and there was a bunch of different teams. And essentially, he looked at how they were working, and he went on this journey of making them the worst team at Microsoft to one of the best, right? And he didn't go in and train them better. They were already, you know, highly efficient. He didn't go in and you know, motivate them. We just made some changes, right? And this was kind of the early stages of what eventually became kind of a pull system, dealing with overburdening, identifying different work services, the idea of work in process limits started to become experiments there where he sort of tried to get some more sustainability around how these teams are working. But guess what? Even though this is the first example documented of Kanban, they never had a Kanban board. And this is one of the interesting things about Kanban is it's not about the board. In fact, you can be doing Kanban without a Kanban board. And the reverse is true too. You could have a Kanban board and you're not doing Kanban, right? So the board is not the signal that you're doing Kanban. Do you have limits? Do you have signals that you have slots, right? Do you have things under control? Are you actively trying to balance your demand and capability, right? If you're actively trying to do that, you could be using Kanban without a board. If you have a board but you're not actively doing that, maybe you're doing something good, but it's not Kanban. So something to consider. Lots of work happened, mostly West Coast, United States. A company named Corbis, David J. Anderson worked there, a number of pioneers of method, where a lot of the stuff that you see today, visual boards, classes of service, WIP limits, the idea of transparency metrics, all started to show up. Cost of delay, as a dominant practice started to be codified. So there were ways of categorizing different work that said, you know what, certain work have a shape that looks like this. If it's delayed, it's okay. Other work looks like this. If it's delayed, it's a big problem. And there's others in between. That's useful information. So you mean I can slow down the stuff that is tolerant to delay, so I can put more energy in the stuff that isn't tolerant to delay, and all of my customers are satisfied? Great, right? So let's codify that approach. So this is where cost of delay became codified as a fairly standard approach in most Kanban practitioners. It also was a time where the first really big projects started to use Kanban. So 55 people was sort of those fairly big, over $10 million, multi-tier boards, the use of portfolios in Kanban, and the realization that when you started to scale up and have portfolio boards versus team boards versus service boards, their needs were very different, and they started to sort of realize what were those needs. So what do boards need to tell you at different levels? Because guess what? This group needs this type of information, this group needs that type of information. They're managing different risks, so the boards actually have to look a little bit different. So the pioneer period led to the enthusiast period in the Blue Book, and I kind of mentioned that. It started, a bunch of underpinnings for a number of practices that hadn't been actually fully documented yet, but the concepts were there for quite a lot of the Kanban practices you actually see today. Going from there, when we talked about Kanban at different parts of organization, the idea of a Kanban set of agendas came up. And this is fairly important because when you're applying Kanban, you kind of need to know where you are in an organization in terms of what problem you're trying to solve, right? So at the very bottom here, there's an agenda of sustainability. So remember the question we had about, what felt better? Round 1 versus round 2. Round 2 felt better, potentially more sustainable. So what are the practices and techniques that allow for that sustainability? When you go up, we're now talking about service orientation. So we had that question about what if each one of the people on the boats represented entire teams or entire divisions or departments, right? The idea of looking at the whole chain of value and solving for that. The idea of service orientation. I need to go in and have excellent services for my customers. I need to optimize for that. And then also survivability. So things like, should I be in the green boat business at all? How much should I have working process as a total organization so that I could pivot to the green boat business? What is the strategy for Boeing? Who had the Boeing comment over here? I think it was this table, right? So that's a survivability problem, right? It's not about excellent services because the service of delivering the 737 MAX could be very good. And the people working on it, sustainable practices. But in terms of how many and how much of the organization am I going to bet on that particular thing is a survivability question. And so you need a different Kanban model for that. How much am I going to go and invest in the green boat versus the white boat versus the red boat business? If I get that wrong, maybe the organization doesn't survive. And that's a different concern. Static was introduced in at least the concepts of static were introduced in the Blue Book, but then codified and written extensively in a book called Kanban from the Inside by Mike Burrows. And it's become the de facto bootstrap for Kanban. So a lot of times people say, we're thinking of introducing Kanban to our group. How do we get about it? What should we do? And there's an easy answer. Use a static model, right? It means the systems thinking approach to introducing Kanban. So the systems thinking is important because it asks you to reflect on the system. What's going on? Who are my customers? What are they happy about? What are they dissatisfied about? What am I going to try and solve? And then it allows you to go in and try and design a Kanban system that you can start working from. And the introducing part is also important in the acronym because it's just a start. Kanban is a process of evolutionary improvement. So when you're thinking about a bootstrap process, it's about how do I start? I'm not going to solve all the problems, but how do I get into a mode where I'm set up so I can start solving some of the problems and keep on working at it iteratively and continuously. So static, if you're thinking about kicking off a Kanban, get the book. It's also part of Kanban training. There's a lot of stuff out there documenting static. Another thing that came up was this concept of Upstream Kanban. And the realization that there's actually two parts of an organization. So we saw kind of the delivery part of the organization in the manufacturing of these boats. The upstream part of the organization is a stack of white paper. And they're going in and they're trying to think about what should we build, what options do we have, what should we do now, what should we do later, what risks should we manage. And so if we can go in and come up with a coherent process to get visibility to that, we can manage that side of demand. And we can also start to have signals. So the delivery side is ready. And so, we don't find ourselves in a situation where things are overburdened, because instead of one paper showing up at a time for you to make boats, nothing arrives for a long time, and then all of a sudden 30 sheets show up, right? How do you control that, make that regular? So Upstream Kanban was introduced to try and introduce some thinking around Kanban in that part of organizations, and they have different things. Like, for example, their introduction of things like WIP minimums, right? So in Deliver, we talk about WIP limits. In Upstream, minimums is, okay, so what's the flow of new ideas, new options, right? We can't get it down to zero, because in the example of Bombardier, right, that's the WIP minimums getting down to zero, in which case we shut down the plant, right? So Upstream Kanban, a guy named Patrick Sterick is a pioneer in this. He's wrote a book called Essential Upstream Kanban. Lots of videos of his on YouTube, you can look that up. We're going into kind of the early adopters phase, and Kanban practices and principles were kind of evolving for several years and then introduced in this book. This is kind of this pyramid here. There's a template that you can download, and you can build your own like 3D version of this, so you can have it sort of sitting at your desk. But it's pretty powerful stuff. The focus here on these principles and practices is trying to be pragmatic and actionable. So let's not go and introduce things that are loaded with, if only we had this, and if only we had that, perfect conditions, if only we had, leadership that got it, or if only we had customers that were reasonable, right? So some of those kind of if only scenarios, while we like to think about that, it's not necessarily very pragmatic, and thus, what you do is not very actionable, right? So what's actually going to lead to results? So there's a bunch of principles on change management. Without going into too much depth into them, it's all about respecting the now, right? Particularly, you look at an organization and said, okay, so you have existing practices, particularly a large organization, it's gotten you this far, you've made a lot of money, they can't all be bad. So let's build on that. Where do we want to improve first? So there's a pragmatism of kind of starting with where you're at today and building from there. The other side of it is a lot of empirical evidence on very negative impacts to large changes all happening at once. The idea of a massive J-curve, right? Huge changes, turnover staff, confusion, chaos, poor business results. So Kanban is very specific about keeping that in check. Don't go in and change too much. Change some things big enough to maybe cause some type of stress that will lead to improvement, but not so big that's unmanageable, right? So there's lots of change management principles there, and then a bunch of core practices. Some you might be familiar with, like visualization and feedback loops, but there's others there as well. The concept of cadences evolved to be very specific. So cadences are essentially different feedback loops, right? So when should we gather to review what? So there's the operating side of the business, so how do we improve things? And there's the delivery side. What are we delivering? How do we go and make sure that's flowing? So there's everything from your daily stand-up type Kanban meeting all the way up to strategic reviews that the CEO should be there, right? And these different cadences are happening at different times, at different frequencies, but ultimately are talking about how are we going to be managing different types of risks at different parts of an organization. In the last few years, enterprise services planning has become something that has been a big focus. But the idea here is, how do we go in and get control of demand even further up in organizations, at the executive level, thinking about how do we anticipate the demand, allocation across various divisions, how do we keep this idea of fitness permeating throughout the whole organization. So there's actually a whole bunch of training there for something, well, enterprise service planning, short form for that is ESP, but the idea here is you're trying to think about how do you go about thinking about demand and your capabilities at the most enterprise level, dealing with that survivability problem. And there's some stuff for executives that's offered from the Kanban University. Fit for purpose, this came out in 2018. Again, very quickly adopted by the Kanban committee about really thinking about this concept of fitness, right? Making your services not agile, but fit. The realization that your customers have various different purposes, and you need to meet those. Some need to be more agile than others, right? So the idea is, if I have a end-of-year tax software package, I can get away with releasing that once a year. I don't have to be that agile with that. That's fit. For that, I will still have customers, I will gain new customers, focus on other things, maybe feature set and other stuff. If I have a social media app, I may have to change that several times in a year. Agility looks very different. So fitness for that versus fitness for that. So understanding these concepts start to become codified within what's called the fit for purpose framework. And I want to leave you on the last bit of this story around probably the biggest deal in Kanban since the Blue Book, and this just launched in its 1.0 version just a few weeks ago. It's been in beta for a couple of years, almost a couple of years, and it's known as the Kanban maturity model. And it used to be that to get Kanban really right, like to get basic Kanban going fairly easy. You read a book, you maybe get together with someone who knows it. But to really get good at this, to really solve large organizational problems, you usually had to hire an expert. And the reason you needed to hire that expert was they need to go in, assess where the organization was at, figure out appropriate advice. And over several years of doing this, the Kanban maturity model showed up as a guide for coaches that were not necessarily full-fledged Kanban experts. Are there any coaches in the room? Any Agile coaches in the room? A few. If you wanted to start coaching Kanban, this is your route to get there, and you don't have to become an expert in it and devote years and years into practice. Because what this has done is introduced a way of lining up what you can observe in your culture and suggesting what are the right practices for where the organization is today. So if they've barely got anything basics and there's low trust, for example, I am not going to go in and introduce a Kanban practice that requires high trust. It's not going to work out. Lots of times people want to do that. Let's go and do this, and we're all going to agree, and it's going to be a great meeting, and all sorts of decisions. Guess what? We can't even talk to each other. So maybe we go in and introduce something lighter, right? And so what this has done is given an appropriateness guide to Agile coaches anywhere who want to coach Kanban to go in and look for certain signs for different things and suggest what is the appropriate practice to come in, right? There might be times where you're not ready for whip limits, right? It might be kind of bad to see people with their hands up, and there's someone walking around the floor and people are idle, right? So if that's your maturity right now, maybe we delay that practice or we introduce a soft version of it. There's an intro version to it. And so obviously the higher on the maturity ladder you go, the more outcomes you can get, but there are always improved outcomes. So there's a book on this that I would suggest any Agile coach who is interested in sort of broadening their Kanban, their practice into Kanban area, this would be a really great route for you guys, and it's just a huge thing. The other thing about Kanban is, why it's been so robust over the last 15 years, it's been there's this back channel peer group that has been doing this globally over the last 15 years, and they're introducing ideas and improvements, and they're being tested in actual real enterprises. And so that's the interesting thing, where things are coming in, and this whole group is embracing this concept of, mutations are good, right? So, what happened to Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer when he had a shiny nose? Nobody wanted to talk to him, right? Has anyone seen Happy Feet, the cartoon with the penguin, right? What happened? They got rid of the penguin that couldn't sing, right? So these are mutations, right? And so one thing that Kanban community has done is recognize that mutations can lead to wonderful things. And so it's constantly looking for what is the next mutation that's going to make this even better. So these get tested. Good mutation, let's continue, build on that. Bad mutation could result in death. Maybe we don't do so much of that, right? So the idea is to go in and continue to build that up and build on this. So, if I were to kind of be invited to talk here about Kanban in 5 years, I'm sure the story will be very different because this is continuously evolving. I'm going to talk very quickly about training. So the group that does this is based out of Seattle, called Lean Kanban University. They offer all sorts of trainings, different groups. So there's training for team members, there's training for managers, people in leadership positions. There's also training for executives. There's training for coaches and so on. So Lean Kanban University, you can Google that. You can find all sorts of information and courses. This data is a little bit old. For 2018, there was about 35,000 people globally trained. Biggest areas, as I mentioned, Europe, UK, USA, and Brazil. Not so much Canada. Canada is still we're in the early phases. So maybe we're like the early adopter phase, maybe one left to the phases that I was discussing. I'm going to post this on Twitter, so you guys get this whole deck. So this thing here will show what are all the different training options that are available. So I'm just going to go in and show you this picture because I think I'm running out of time. Only because I really wanted to show this, and I had a lot of fun with this one. But the one myth I'll leave you with is you have to choose Kanban versus something else. So hey, we chose to do Kanban versus Scrum, or we're doing SAFe, right? Kanban is not a versus thing, right? Kanban is there to improve a process. So if you're doing Scrum, use Kanban to make Scrum excellent. You're doing XP, SAFe, use Kanban to make that better, right? So the idea here is you're not going and doing an or, right? Remember when I talked about change management practices? You respect what's already there. So Kanban is not this sort of final choice, I'm locked into Kanban. It's about, okay, so I'm doing this as a process. Maybe it's my existing process, or maybe I've chosen a process like Scrum. Do I want to use a method to improve it? And Kanban is that method that allows you to do it. So it allows you to sort of pick and choose its entry point and go and do it. So it's not this sort of versus thing. All right. Thank you very much.